So last time we showed that a supreme God exists, and tonight what we're going to be looking at is how much dirty work did this supreme being actually do in order to bring about life on our planet. I'm going to first segue into the teleological argument. This is another argument for God's existence, but I felt that it fit better in this week's course than it did last week's. So it goes something like this. The fine-tuning of the universe for permitting life is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Second premise is it's not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore it's due to design. So basically what this argument is saying is that there are several potencies in our universe, such as the expansion rate of the universe, the nuclear forces, the weak force, the strong force, the up force, and the down force, and the gravitational constant. There's all these things we learn in our math and physics classes, which are just arbitrary constants that look to be pulled out of thin air, but yet everything works so beautifully in perfect harmony that it permits life on our planet. So basically, this is due to physical necessity, meaning that the universe is orderly on its own. Chance, which is just, okay, let's take a shot in the dark here and maybe we'll get it. Or design, that's the third option. So it's not due to physical necessity. We know that through the theory of entropy and the second law of thermodynamics and other things that the universe is very unstable. It's trying to reach equilibrium, but there's equal and opposite reactions that happen, so it's very unorganized. There's explosions in stars, there's the nuclear fusion and fission in our sun. Everything is chaotic in behavior. So it's not due to physical necessity. Otherwise there would be more than just one observable Earth that has life on it. We don't know if there's any life anywhere else, but if it was due to physical necessity, we would start to see more civilizations and the existence of intelligent life in other places of the universe. Next, we have chance. It's not really due to chance, because in order for these things to all line up and work perfectly with these arbitrary constants, if they were altered 1 part in 10 to the 100, so that's 10 with 100 zeros behind it. So for those of you math geeks, if any of those constants were changed even that little, at that far back of a decimal place, life would not be able to exist in our universe. So all these different constants and seemingly arbitrary functions are actually precisely tuned for life to exist in our universe. The chances that you would have so many, there's about a dozen of these different constants that would be so maximally tuned for life in our universe, for those to all just be random, chances are just minuscule. There's absolutely no way to possibly think that it's due to chance. Now, there are some scientists that try to preserve this idea of chance, because they know it's not physical necessity, but they don't want to say design because that would imply God, right? So they say, okay, to maintain chance, there's an infinite number of universes that we can't see, and ours just happens to be the one where all 12 of those constants are tuned in such a way that it permits life. Okay? Now what that's doing is, number one, it's only punting the problem up one level. We showed last time that any inflationary system of universes, or any universe, or any planetary system, if it's expanding, it had a singular point that it started at. So all that does is kick it up a notch and say, okay, well, who created the multiverse? Where did all these infinite number of universes come from? So all it does is kick the problem up one more level upstairs. But with the Kalam cosmological argument, we can show that it still took an intelligent designer to set that into motion. So therefore, we're left with design. So that's the only thing, that's the only option left for the explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for life. So it's with our best explanation and the amount of data that we have to conclude that it's due to an intelligent designer in our universe. So I thought that was a lot better suited in tonight's topics than it was last week, and we'll see why in a minute. So on the subject of creation and evolution, does anybody want to give me some of their interpretations of what the creation story is about, what evolution is about, stuff like that.
Just one thing I heard on that is as far as the timetable of evolution goes that we've talked about in different eras and species evolving, the evolutionary steps and the timetables that are required in order to process and eventually get to where they are, from just kind of what the basics of what I've seen, would take way too long than what's been said. And so, like, for instance, blood clotting is a great example. For blood platelets to form, as an example, for blood platelets to form and to clot, that survival skill would take 8 or 9 of these evolutionary steps that take way too long for this kind of, these eras that have been set forth and kind of been told that, okay, this is the time frame that has been given for these species to evolve into this, and it would take much, much longer. I mean, like, almost like triple or more, like, much, much longer. So.
Yeah, that's good. I like that you brought that up. I'm actually going to get into that later. In regards to Genesis 1 and 2, there's a lot of misconceptions about the timetables there. Like you said, like is it actually 6 24-hour days of creation, or is it very vague? Is it a long period of time for each day, and it was just time segments divided up into 6 time segments? So a little bit of background information just for some clarity and some context. Genesis was written about 1500 BC, give or take 200-300 years either direction. It was believed to be written by Moses. If it wasn't Moses, it was somebody close to him, because the first 5 books of the Bible were all written mainly from his perspective, or at least the leader's perspective of the nation of Israel. So the Israelites were wandering the desert, and they all had these different gods, these pagan gods that they were worshiping. And for obvious reasons, since they were God's chosen people, then Moses and the other elders didn't like that. And so what they did was they heard these rumors that these pagan gods had their own myths or legends on how the earth was created and formed. And so what it's believed that hi Nate. What it's believed is that Moses or someone close to him wrote Genesis to give a Yahweh-based parable on creation. So for all intents and purposes, Genesis 1 and 2 was not meant to be a very strict textbook timeline. It's just supposed to be a parable or an illustration. It was inspired by God, if we believe that the Bible is God's holy word. So it is God-breathed, but at the same time, like this quote here, we can't hold something to the scale of precision if it was never meant to be very precise. So there's a lot of debate on this, and this is really a kind of a minor point in the fact, if God wants to create the illusion of time of billions of years, He certainly has the power and the capability to do that. But as far as us in the observable universe, for all intents and purposes, it could have been millions and billions of years. So for the purposes of this study, that's what we're going to hold on to, is the day-age theory of creation. Do you have something?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go for it.
So I feel like most people who advocate anything other than design really desire to look at like something that's very concrete and just time orderly. And so when we're kind of engaging in a conversation with someone who insists on kind of a time frame, or just like, doesn't that seem like somewhat of a cop-out? Of if it wasn't meant to be precise, then we can't really say. Do you know what I'm saying?
I can definitely see what you're saying. And St. Augustine in around 300 AD said in his commentary on Genesis that the days don't need to be interpreted literally. This came 1,500 years before Darwin in his time. So this isn't a retreat. This isn't, okay, now we've got this carbon dating thing. Okay, religion, how are you going to prove that this, your Bible says it was 6 days and only a few thousand years ago. How do you compare? It's not a retreat from science. This came 1,500 years before Darwin even suggested natural selection. So let's get into design. So design is the purpose, planning, or intention that exists or is thought to exist behind an action, fact, or material object. So one of the big things is that design is easy to recognize versus naturalistic formations, and this is critical to the creationist. So there's several different examples here, like Mount Rushmore. If you looked at Mount Rushmore, you would never say in 100 years that, that's just a natural formation. If you've ever seen a human before and you see Mount Rushmore, you know that there was some design going into that. Humans have a way of recognizing things that aren't really there. Like, we see a rock and you're like, oh, that looks like a face, or oh, that looks like a fish, or clouds or stuff like that. That's due to our imagination. But still, it's extremely obvious when something is designed versus when something is just formed naturally. Same thing with arrowheads. You can tell if that's carved versus just a pointy-looking rock. The Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence program, that's the crux of that program, is they're looking for radio waves and signatures in outer space to determine whether or not it's just space noise or if it is actually something intelligent from another society. So even in secular science, we still understand that design is easy to recognize from naturalistic stuff. The eyeball, Darwin even said in his own, you see the quote there, Darwin even said in his own book that he still doesn't understand how the eye could fit into his theory, but he just trusted that it was going to go forward. Nick, what you were saying about the giraffe, when the giraffe bends down to get a drink of water from the pond or whatever, its heart is about 2 feet wide, and all that blood has to go up the neck. So when the giraffe leans down, all that blood surges to the brain. If the giraffe did not have a sponge-like material at the base of its brain that absorbed all that blood while it was drinking water, its head would explode, basically. So what we see there is something that could not have been formed naturally. For an evolutionary need to exist, it's got to be a life or death situation. And like you said, with the blood clotting, if you're bleeding out or you're a giraffe laying on the ground with blood coming out of your ears, there's not time to make 8, 10, 12 different generations to find a genetic defect and then form a new species. Neither is it, the giraffe isn't even going to survive itself without that thing. You never would have gotten an animal with such a long neck had it not had an adaptation such as that. So it's evident to see design right there. Also with the butterfly, I read this week. I thought this was really interesting. When a caterpillar gets into a cocoon, its entire body dissolves. There's no brain, there's no nervous system, there's no cardiovascular system. It's just goo. When they open up a cocoon, it's nothing but goo. But when it comes out, it's a butterfly. It's a completely different creature. They also did a study where they had these caterpillars and they had them go towards this scent, and every time they got close to whatever was making the scent, they would zap them. So the caterpillars would draw an association to pain with this smell, so they would avoid the smell. Well, then they let the caterpillars make cocoons and everything, and then when they were the butterflies, after they had completely broken down into nothing more than proteins and acids, they were still not attracted to that scent, even though other butterflies and caterpillars not in the experiment were. So it still maintains its memory, it still maintains its instincts and everything else, even though inside the cocoon it's nothing but goo. So I thought that was really cool. That's, I can't think of any way that wasn't designed. Also, intelligent minds, humans are the only ones that have a cognitive understanding of their own existence. So that is another platform for the design argument. And there's many, many more. But again, so that's the crux, and that's the basis for design, is that it's easy to recognize versus naturalistic explanations, and it requires more information than is given in natural selection. All right, so what is evolution? Okay, evolution is a process of continuous change from a simpler state to a higher, complex, or better state. So basically, it's what you've heard all along. It's things that are simple getting more complicated, which is more advantageous. Now, there's two forms of Darwinism. There's Darwinism, classic, and then there's neo-Darwinism. Darwinism is a theory that all living creatures are modified descendants of a common ancestor. So just like the tree of life, or the thing you've seen in your science textbook, everything started out as this one little single-celled amoeba that turned into a fish, which turned into a lizard that crawled onto land and stuff like that. Then there's neo-Darwinism, which is kind of a theory that's adapted from the intense criticism Darwinism has had, and it's the theory that genetic modifications are the result of natural selection among random genetic mutations. And just like what you hit on, Griffin, one of the main arguments against that is that natural selection doesn't create vastly new species. Like you said, it's just fluctuations. Take the moth, for example. This was what I was taught in middle school and high school, is that you've got white moths and black moths. Okay, they're the same species, but one had a genetic problem and they turned black, and the normal ones were white. Well, all of a sudden a forest burns down and everything turns black. Well, all the white moths are going to get eaten because they're easier to see, while the black ones have camouflage. So that's natural selection at work right there. But you give the time frame long enough to recover, and it's just going to be slow fluctuations between one or two genetic mutations that don't actually produce an entirely new genus or family or something like that. So that's the basis for evolution. So let's take the living cell as an example. I think it's a really good example because it's the building block for all life. We can't say that there's anything that's built from different things other than cells. So let's start at the DNA. Your DNA and your human cells, if you were to string it out, it'd be about 6 feet long. Okay. There's more information in that one strand of DNA than an entire set of encyclopedia. It's just mind-blowing how much information is actually in your DNA. And your DNA is very, very passive. It's not active. So it's not adding new strings every time a cell is replicated. It's not rearranging itself. It more or less stays the same, and it's replicated and copied, just like a copy machine. And after so many different photocopies, you start to see smudges and ink blurs and stuff like that. So that's where genetic mutations come in, is when it gets copied so many times. That's where we get cancer from and some other things. But DNA is more of a reference for the cell. Charles Darwin was actually really humble in his own work. In his book, he says several times that there's several different ways that his theories could be shut down. And this is one of them. It says, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not be possibly found, could have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Charles Darwin and the scientists at the time had a very ignorant understanding of the living cell. They thought the cell was in their microscopes, all they could see was this and a nucleus. So all they saw was just a circle of gel, squishy stuff with a big dot in the middle. And they thought that's as complicated as it got. So, but now we know that, for a number of examples, we've got the lipid bilayer, which is an intense, passive filtration system, letting stuff in and out of the cell, knowing what stuff to let in and out of the cell. You've got ribosomes, and in some cases chloroplasts, and a cell wall, and just many, many, many other things that Darwin just had no knowledge of. So, using his words right here, the cell has what we call irreducible complexity. Can somebody really quick give me all the components of a mousetrap? Piece of wood, okay.
Spring.
Okay, we got a spring, so we got the piece of wood. And then we got a spring here. Wire? Are you talking about the
release lever, yeah.
Okay.
And then
so the trap, the actual trap. What else?
And then a release lever.
The release lever that holds this down.
Pressurized release lever.
Oh, the plate.
Yeah, it was a pressure plate that goes to the release lever.
Okay, and then the release lever goes here, right? It holds this down.
And then cheese.
And then cheese. Okay.
That's necessary. And maybe some paint on there too, just to make it look good. Peanut butter on the cheese. Nate's peanut butter on the cheese is necessary as well.
Okay. I'll put some peanut butter. Okay. So a mousetrap minus the cheese. Mousetrap minus the cheese has 5 basic components. Okay. So what we've got. Oh well, you just told them to me. So we've got the 5 components. If any of those components were put together in any other configuration on the piece of wood, or not on the piece of wood, if they were put together in any configuration, or if the parts were different sizes, the mousetrap would catch no mice. There's an extremely narrow set of tolerances that each piece of the mousetrap has to be within in order to work. Okay, and all these pieces are codependent on one another. The trap is not going to work if the lever isn't connected to the thing that holds the snap down. The snap's not going to work if there's no spring. If the spring is too big, it's not going to fit on the block of wood. If the spring is too small, it's not going to swing back hard enough to kill the mouse. If the block of wood is way too big, it just causes problems. And so everything has to be so perfectly aligned that the mousetrap works. In the same way, the living cell has this kind of complexity. The ribosomes and the cell wall and everything, they work as a filtration system, and they're the workers of the cell. If you don't have all those parts already together working in a cooperative relationship, there will be no life had in the cell. Scientists in labs can't even disassemble and reassemble a cell to make it work. So even scientists with intelligence and tools cannot disassemble a cell and with all the components, regardless of how they got them, put them all back together. So for the argument for the living cell, it looks like design wins, because it had to have existed from the top down. So we're going to get into that a little bit later. So with your DNA, the reproduction, the proteins, ribosomes, cell wall, all those things are interdependent. I like this quote from Stephen C. Meyer. He says, "Imagine closing your eyes and pulling out letters of a Scrabble bag and produce Hamlet." That's the equivalent of coming up with at least one code for a protein in DNA. You guys all seen the magnets that go in the fridge and you can spell things out, or words or sentences. Okay, you know how the words stick, or the letters stick to the fridge? Okay, but each letter is not dependent on the next one. You can slide the word "but" right next to "face," just as easily as you can say "pretty face." The words and letters together have no interdependence. It's the same thing with DNA. DNA, they want to. You got the double helix, right? Pretend that's a double helix. Okay, so the G, A, T, and C can bond to the double helix, the backbone, magnetically. There's a chemical attraction there. But to determine the next step, there is no magnetism or any other kind of force that self-aligns the DNA. So everything has to be very carefully manipulated, or in some cases, like you were saying earlier, Griffin and Nick, it takes such a long time. 6 feet long, even at the microscopic level, to create the human DNA. There is not enough time in our universe to have the probabilities of that happening. There have only been around 10 to the 17th seconds in the existence of the universe. That's about the number of seconds. Okay, we're talking about probabilities that are, like I mentioned earlier with the constants and everything, we're talking about numbers that are astronomical. The steps, like you were talking about earlier, the time it takes for each of those steps to develop just one trait or just one piece of DNA that would work would take a lot more time than what the universe allows.
I'd say you could even throw in the whole idea of this become even more complicated if you kind of look at the fact that the human body is made up of, I don't know how many different kinds of cells, but like skin cells, different kinds of cells for your fingernails, teeth, hair follicles, everything else, and it all started from 2 cells individually. And they actually somehow managed to mutate into different kinds of cells in the right order, in the way that when they mutate, they actually hold that same mutation and they're able to pass on to their next copy, but still form one giant structure.
Yeah, exactly. You could have an entire sequence of human DNA, but if you get the skin cells and the muscle cells reversed, you're not going to fare very well with your skin being made of muscle and vice versa. So you're exactly right. It just adds to the complexity that there's different cells and it all comes from 2 cells. So as far as the living cell is concerned, it seems that there has to be some kind of intelligent design behind it all. Yeah, and that's just another quote saying, basically, if we found the amount of information that's contained in DNA from outer space, we would know without a doubt that it's evidence of intelligent life somewhere else. But when we see it in nature, we say it's the work of random forces. So I want to talk a little bit about evolution, and one of their main problems, hurdles that they have to jump over, is the Cambrian explosion. Now, we get into a little bit of trouble with timelines here because carbon dating has tons of inconsistencies and stuff like that. But if we just go with the average values and what the scientists go by, if we take their information and follow the evidence where it leads, we can end up with a pretty cool explanation. So, yeah, the oldest fossil is around 3.5 billion years ago, and it's for blue-green algae. So very simple, talking about the lowest tier of life here. And about 542 million years ago, so not very long ago, geologically, the Cambrian explosion happened. So up until this point, from blue-green algae up into the Cambrian explosion, we have things like worms and algae, amoebas, jellyfish, and sponges, things that really have no nervous system, very little cognitive ability. They have nothing in the way of complexity, like several organs. The worms there is used pretty liberally. It wasn't the worm as we know it now. It was just a very long strand-like thing that was basically one type of cell. So we're looking at things that have no nervous system, no brain, no heart, things like that. And all of a sudden, we start to see these different organisms popping out of nowhere. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. I put up together a timeline here to kind of help drive this home. So on the left here, you see 600 million years ago. And from 600 million years ago, remember 540-something million years ago is when the Cambrian explosion happened. So roughly a little bit before the Cambrian explosion to the present age is about 5 football fields. Okay? So to the first fossil of that blue-green algae, it took 2 miles of football fields geologically to evolve to the point where we have worms, sponges, jellyfish, things that were still extremely, extremely simple, but were a little bit bigger. And then all of a sudden, if you'll notice, I got a little red line on there. That little red line represents 7 yards. That's where the Cambrian explosions. All of a sudden, we start seeing all these different phylum. And so, it took us 2 miles of football fields, remember, to get from algae to worms and jellyfish and sponges. And then all of a sudden, in 7 yards, we start seeing things like insects, crabs, starfish, modern vertebrates, fish develops shortly thereafter. And what we see here is what we call top-down evolution. When you design a car, Griffin, I know you like this, or Sam, when you design a car, what do? You take last year's model, you tweak a few things, and then, hey, look, it's next year's model, okay? That is how the theory of natural selection and Darwinism work, is they say, okay, it's very slight modifications from what already exists, and eventually it'll branch off into something so different we call it a different genus or a different family and stuff like that. So, but what happened here in the Cambrian explosion, we went from worms, algae, amoebas, and jellyfish to insects, crabs, starfish, fish, vertebrates, stuff like that. This is very top-down evolution. So instead of there being a slight modification to your skateboard, which gave you a bicycle, which gave you, a steam cart or, stuff like that, instead of a slow process, all of a sudden we're going from, 4-wheeled bicycles all the way to a 2015 Subaru Forester, mid-size pickup truck, and a family sedan, just out of nowhere. Okay, so that's what we call top-down evolution, is you get a final product that took way too short of a time to have been branched off like that. 2 scientists, one of them's from the University of California Museum of Paleontology, and the other one's from the Smithsonian. They both say in one of their books that the Cambrian explosion is too big to be masked by flaws in the fossil record. Darwin said in his book, he said, okay, there's more fossils that we haven't found yet that will show the missing link between the fossil records of them showing from algae and sponges all the way to fish and modern mammals and stuff. And so, but these 2 scientists seem to think otherwise. They're saying the fossil record is pretty complete, about as complete as we can find, and this is way too big to have not had an outside influence. So my personal opinion is that God introduced life into the universe. I think the difference between no life and life to getting a living cell is just, the odds are astronomical. So I feel like, this is my personal opinion, I feel like God introduced life into the universe, and then from there, at the Cambrian explosion, he started pushing potencies to make these different kinds of animal and phylum and stuff like that. So again, that's my personal opinion. You'll have to do some research on your own to get your own opinion. That's just what I've got. And so Dr. William Lane Craig is a pretty well-known apologist, and I think he sums up the topic of evolution and creation pretty well in this video clip, so I'll just show that now. Basically, there's two main points from that. Creation isn't a vital component to Christianity. So it's not so important that you have to believe in creation versus evolution versus anything else that you say that God exists and that Jesus is your personal Savior. That's not a critical component to the Christian faith. Although it is important, it's not critically important to what C.S. Lewis calls mere Christianity. And the second point is that evolution is extremely improbable. I think we've showed that tonight. Made a very good case for at least evidence that shows that God had to have gotten his hands dirty after the initial Big Bang, setting up the universe. There had to have been some sort of interaction from a deity, and thus giving a little bit more evidence for God. So, how do you apply what we learned tonight? Kind of what Nick started off with. Number one, with love and respect, as always. Remember that core issues with Christianity and stuff are usually emotional in nature, so they usually hide behind science or they hide behind arguments for atheism to just kind of hide the fact that they've got an emotional problem. So be ready to deal with matters of the heart if you get to peel back that many layers. If you don't know the answer to a question, don't punt to faith. Don't just say, well, it's by faith we believe it. Just give the person a promise. Just say, hey, I don't know the answer to that, but I will either find somebody that does or I'll go do more research on my own. And actually follow up with that. What that does is it gives you an easy opportunity to start a second conversation, and it lets you control the dialogue. Research. I've already said this. The more you learn, the better you can articulate your explanation of creation or evolution or however you decide to define it. And remember that God is the cause of the universe. Evolution is pretty much irrelevant once you can show that God started off the universe through the Big Bang. And it's much easier to argue something like that God started the universe than it is to deal with these little inconsistencies in science that change every 10 years, right? So always know more than your opponent, but don't fire hose them. If you fire hose them with information, they're just going to get lost and they're not really going to follow. So make sure you're putting it in terms that they can understand and giving them good reasons to believe the facts that you're giving. So next week we're going to cover the topic of free will. I'm really excited about that. So that's pretty much it for tonight. Anybody have any questions?
None.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.